In this tutorial we are going to learn how to insert tempo and dynamics into Muse Score. Before we get to dynamics we are going to look at inserting the tempo. The tempo indicates how fast or slow a piece is to be played. In Muse Score there are two ways to enter the tempo, either with a number in beats per minute or a description text. A few hundred years ago up to the 19th century, it was common to see a description for the tempo in Italian. You will see phrases like largo, adagio, moderato, allegro, presto, etc., which tells you roughly how fast or slow you need to play a piece. You may come across a term like tempo di minuetto to indicate that the piece is in the speed of a dance. You may also see a term in French like vite for fast. By the 20th century, composers in the English-speaking world started to insert English phrases like bright or lively as a tempo reference instead of Italian terms like allegro or presto for a fast tempo. In older versions of Muse Score there was a menu full of Italian terms for the tempo you can add to a score. In newer versions, you would insert a tempo marking with a number instead. We will open a piece of music and insert the tempo marking starting from the first measure. There are two places we can go to insert a tempo marking. The easiest is to go to the palettes on the left, and under tempo we will find ones with different reference notes. Simply drag the one we want over the note or rest we want and release. Remove the tempo marking on the score and we will use the other way of inserting a tempo marking. We need to select the note or rest on the beat where the tempo marking will go, and then we will go to the top menu bar and under Add, and then Text, we will find that option. Here we see a quarter note followed by an equal sign and the number 80 for the default number of beats per minute. Unlike the previous method, you find that there is just one option for the reference note, which is a quarter note. You can change it later. Under the inspector panel on the right, we find that the text style is set to tempo. You can click on different options and see what happens to the text. You will find that the text is placed in different positions with different fonts and sizes. The tempo option at the default setting is the most suitable to use. We will leave the font style as is. We are going to do a playback to hear how this piece sounds at the current tempo. Here the tempo marking is in the edit mode. We will click anywhere on the white space to turn the edit mode off. Then we press the rewind button and play the first two measures starting from the beginning. If we need to change the reference note, we have two ways of doing it. The first way is to remove the current tempo marking and drag a different one from the tempo menu under palettes into the score. The other way is to double-click on the tempo marking and then highlight to select the reference note. On the bottom left where we see the button for inserting special characters, we click to open the menu. Here we are going to double-click on the new note to replace the current reference note. When we are done, we click on the top left or right corner to close the menu depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC. We can adjust the size of the text and the note symbol to make them bigger or smaller if we want to. We can change the number of beats per minute a few times until we find the ideal tempo. Many scores show a text description for the tempo to describe how the piece should be played. The description does not specify the exact speed of a piece, which is at the discretion of the performers. Before the 19th century, when the metronome was invented, composers did not include the number of beats per minute into the score. We will move the tempo marking a bit higher, and enter the text slow and moving just above the staff. We will select the first note where the text would be inserted. Then we are going to go to the Add menu and under Text choose Staff Text. Once we are done, We can go to the inspector panel on the right and change the text style. Here we will choose tempo from the menu. Changing the text style is optional. As long as your score is easy to read, you're okay. We want to leave the number of beats per minute on the score so that the playback would be at the preferred speed. If we don't want the number to show when we print out the sheet music, we can click to select the tempo marking, then go to the inspector panel and uncheck the box that says visible. When we click on the white space to turn off the highlighting, we should see the tempo marking faded out. There are scores you will see just a description text for the tempo without the number of beats per minute. The other way to enter a description text is to highlight the tempo marking and type the text over it. We will remove the staff text that says the same thing since it is redundant. Move the text down a little bit and we put the check mark back in the inspector panel to make it visible. At the bottom of the inspector panel, we see the heading tempo and a number that is faded. On top of it is a box that says follow text. We uncheck the box and we can change the number to whatever we want. What the follow text option does, is to set the tempo according to what is on the tempo marking if there is a number showing. If we decided not to show a number on the sheet music, we can set the number of beats per minute here. If you need to change the tempo throughout the score, you simply insert new tempo markings with new numbers. There are times we want to speed up or slow down a piece for a few notes and then return to the original tempo. For example, if we want to put in a retard, inserting the text RIT on the score is not the problem. The issue is whether or not we can get Muse Score to play back the way we want. First we are going to add a fermata to a note and show what can be done to make it play back correctly. We can find the symbol under the Articulations and Ornaments menu under the palette. If we used an older version of Muse Score, what we might do to make the notes with the fermata play slower is to add a tempo marking on it with a slower tempo. Then add another tempo marking with the original tempo to the note after. And check the visible box on both tempo markings so they won't show on the score. The newer versions of Muse Score does allow you to do a time stretch on the fermata. We will press the undo button a few times to remove the tempo markings we just added. We click on the fermata. On the inspector panel we will find the time stretch option. We enter a higher number to make the note play longer. We will select the first note in the measure before the fermata and do a playback to hear the note play longer. The next thing we are going to do is to add a retard starting from a few notes before the fermata. Muse Score doesn't have a feature for slowing down or speeding up the music gradually in the playback. The closest we can do is to add tempo changes and then back to the original tempo. One way to do it is to select the starting note and enter the letters RIT as staff text. When we are done, we can change the font style to italic for easy reading, which is common in many scores. The retard can be placed on top or below the staff, so we can leave it as is. Here we are just entering a piece of text as reference for the musicians with no regard for the tempo slowing down when we do a playback in Muse Score. The next obvious thing to do would be to add tempo markings to give the impression that the piece is slowing down and then return to the original speed when we do a playback. We are going to remove the text we just added. And then we will add two tempo markings into the score. The first will be at the spot where we want to slow down and the other where the tempo returns to the original. We can copy the original tempo marking, paste it in two different places and adjust the number of beats per minute where we need to slow down. For the tempo marking where we play slower, we will highlight the text and change it to RIT. We can set the text style to staff text to look smaller. And change the font style to italics as before. The tempo marking where the music returns to the original speed, we can change the text to our tempo. We can change the text and font styles as the previous tempo marking. Move the tempo markings a bit higher so that they don't overlap with the notes. When we do a playback for the whole piece, we can hear what it sounds like with the retard and the fermata. We can turn the metronome on to hear the beat. Next we will look at how to insert dynamics. We close the menus that are not needed under the palette. At the bottom of the palette we see the options Basic and Advanced. We are going to leave the setting at Advanced so that we can access a bigger list of items. When we open the Dynamics menu, we see 23 items listed. Only the first 8 and starting from the 3 Ps to the 3 Fs can play back properly in Muse Score. The other ones are for reference only. Next we are going to insert some dynamics into the piece. In Muse Score the default playback setting is at mezzo forte if there is no dynamic marking in the music. In the beginning of this piece we will insert a mezzo piano which is not very loud. We can drag an MP to the beginning of the score. Note that the dynamic mark is always placed below the staff. After we place the dynamic mark, we can move it a little bit with the pointer if it overlaps with a note. The other way to fine-tune the position of a dynamic mark is to select it and use your arrow keys. As you are moving it around, you will notice that the number for the horizontal and vertical offset will change as the text is moved. If we need to move a dynamic mark to a different note or rest, we simply drag a dynamic mark across the bottom of the staff. We will see a vertical dash line over the dynamic mark as we are moving. This line is telling us the spot where the mark is aligned to. For this piece we will leave the mezzo piano under the first note. At the fermata we will use a double forte to make the note sound very loud. Instead of dragging the double forte to the note with the fermata, we can select the note and double-click on the dynamic mark. For the note after we will put in another mezzo piano the same way. We will put in a piano for the last note to quiet down the piece. After we enter the dynamics, there are things we can fine-tune. The first is the font size. Since a dynamic mark is a piece of text, we can go down to the bottom and adjust the font size or even change the text if we want. The other thing we can adjust is the velocity. The default will give you one volume setting. Some of the time you will find that playing a section of music louder or softer than the default setting to be more ideal, so you can change the number here. Above the velocity is a setting called dynamic range. The default setting is part. The other two options are staff and system. We will get to it later on. We will click on the white space to turn off the editing mode for the dynamic mark. Next turn off the metronome, rewind to the beginning and do a playback to hear how the music sounds with the dynamics added. It is less distracting with the ticking sound off.
The playback sounded okay. What we can do to make it sound better is to add crescendo and decrescendo that looks like the greater than and less than signs to give a smoother transition between two dynamic marks. We will find the two symbols in the lines menu under the palette. We can drag a symbol to the starting note we want and release, or we can select the note and double-click on a symbol to add it into the score. Either will work. To make the piece play properly in Muse Score, we need to adjust the anchor point on the right so that the crescendo and decrescendo extends all the way to the next dynamic mark. What we will do is double-click on the crescendo, then hold the shift and press the right arrow. Pressing the left arrow would make the line go the other way. When we are done, we can move the squares around to adjust the shape of the line as needed. We can do the same with the other line as well. When we do a playback, we should hear a gradual transition from one dynamic mark to the next. The next example we will look at is a piece of music that uses the short form of the text for crescendo and decrescendo. It's okay to use the symbols from the previous example to do the job. When a crescendo or decrescendo spans more than one line, it's tidier to put in the text and dash lines that extends to 2 or more lines of music. Under the Lines menu we will find the text CRES. We drag it to the note where the crescendo will go. We can also select the note first and then double-click on the CRES to add it into the score. Either will work. Next, we need to move the anchor point of the crescendo to the next dynamic mark as in the previous example. We double-click the text. Then hold the shift and press the right arrow. We see that dash lines are added. Suppose we need to add a decrescendo that is not in the Lines menu, we use the CRES and change the text after. We will move the anchor point of the decrescendo to the next dynamic mark. At the bottom of the inspector panel under hairpin type we change the crescendo to decrescendo. We are not done yet. We got the music to play back correctly but the text is wrong. We right-click and open the Line Properties menu. On a Mac you need to hold the Control key before doing the right-click. Here we see 3 text boxes: Begin, Continue, and End. The Begin text box is for the text before the dash lines. The Continue box is for the text on the next line if the crescendo or decrescendo spans more than one line. The End box is for the text at the end of the dash lines. We change the Begin text to DECRES for decrescendo. The other 2 text boxes we will leave blank. There are places where we will see a crescendo span for a few notes followed by a decrescendo for a few notes. This is common in music notation but Muse Score won't be able to play back properly unless there is a dynamic mark on both ends of a crescendo or decrescendo. We copy the dynamic mark before the first crescendo. Then paste it in the middle of the 2. We will set the dynamic mark in the middle to invisible and change the velocity to a higher number. We should be able to get the piece to play back properly. Earlier we talked about dynamic range settings under the inspector panel. We are going to explain the 3 options right now. We will open a piece of music for an ensemble and add some dynamics. We see that a piece for an ensemble or orchestra has many staffs stacked on top of each other. In this piece we see 4 instruments and each has just one staff. Suppose we add a dynamic mark like a forte in the beginning of the first violin part. In the inspector panel under dynamic type, we will see part as the default option. Each instrument is treated as a separate part. When you have a piano score with 2 staffs or an organ score with 3, all the staffs of the same instrument is treated as one part. If you want to insert the same dynamics for every instrument in the score, all you need to do is to add dynamic marking to one of the instruments and change the dynamic range to SYSTEM system. In this case, what we added to the violin 1 part applies to all other parts when you do a playback. Inserting just one set of dynamics in an orchestral score is uncommon because you may want to distribute the separate parts for each musician. Every part should have its own dynamic marking even if they are the same as the violin 1 part. We change the dynamic range back to part and then simply copy the dynamic mark from the first violin to the same spot for all the other instruments. In an orchestral score, we can make an instrument louder or softer relative to the others. Besides adjusting the velocity for each dynamic mark, you can open the mixer and adjust the volume. Here we are going to make the violin 1 louder because it is playing the melody. We go to View on top and open the mixer menu. In the mixer we see that every string instrument has 3 sound settings including pizzicato and tremolo. All we want to change is the volume of the first violin. The other sound effects do not apply. When we do a playback, we should hear the first violin sound louder. We are going to look at a piano piece that has different dynamic marking for the treble and the bass clefs. Many piano scores have dynamic marking between 2 staffs that apply to both. In Muse Score you'd enter dynamic marking under the top staff. When we open this piece, we see that dynamic marking has already been added to the top and bottom staffs. To make the piece play back properly in Muse Score, all we need to do is go through each one and change the dynamic range under the inspector panel to STAFF staff so that each dynamic mark is applied to the staff immediately above it instead of both. Save the piece and close. The one question many people asked is how to make the lower staff of a piano piece softer in the playback. We are going to open a piece and show how this is done. The right melody line of a piano is often played louder so that it stand out. One way is to copy the dynamic marks under the top staff to the bottom individually. After pasting a dynamic mark, we change the dynamic range to staff so that it only apply to the staff immediately above it. Decrease the velocity so that we get a softer sound. We also change the dynamic range of the original dynamic mark to staff. A lot of piano pieces are performed with the left part softer without saying so in the score. What you do is make each duplicate dynamic mark in the lower staff invisible. When you do a playback, you should hear the lower part play softer. Save the piece and we're done. Bye for now and thank you for watching.